Hello there, and welcome to the Disney Star Wars Writers Room. You must be nervous. I know I was on my first day here, but don't you worry. I'm here to teach you everything you need to know about how to write for Star Wars in current year. Over the course of these training videos, you will learn a myriad of different modern writing techniques, including why cause and effect is for losers, how to emasculate your male heroes in favor of younger, less problematic protagonists, as well as a compendium on manipulating your audience through the use of cute droid sidekicks. But that's all a bit advanced for our first lesson. Today, we're going to talk about something a little smaller scale. Something less consequential to Star Wars as an IP. Today, we're going to talk about lightsaber fights. Now, if you're coming into this knowing absolutely nothing about lightsabers, don't sweat it. Here at Disney, being completely unfamiliar with the subject matter you're writing is not only acceptable, it's a prerequisite. Write what you know, more like write what you don't know and change it until it fits your worldview. In fact, the first rule of writing for a Disney project is don't get caught up in trying to make sure everything in your story makes sense or fits canon or whatever. The only people who really care about that stuff are the toxic fans, the type who complain for hours and hours about world building and consistency and blah, blah, blah. We don't need that type of negativity here. And besides, we already have a process where every Star Wars script goes through a final vetting process with this guy named Pablo, our resident lore master. And it's his job to read through your script and make sure it doesn't contradict with something from Star Wars history. I know, one guy responsible for all of that. Isn't it great? So you just let him worry about all that nerd stuff while you focus on writing the story the way you want to. Now, if you're anything like the rest of us Disney writers, you're probably feeling the itch to want to be super subversive in your writing. I love it. That's great. Hold on to that mentality. Subversion is such a cheap and easy way to get people talking about your project. Drum up some controversy. But the best way to be subversive is to first get a good surface level understanding of the way things used to work so that you know how best to undercut and reshape it to fit your narrative. And when it comes to lightsaber combat, the best place to begin is with lightsaber training. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Max, I wasn't going to have the characters in my story do any training at all. Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally with you on that. Training sequences in movies are so boring, and they never ever do anything to give insight into the characters or their worldviews at all. They just take up runtime where more important scenes could go. But from time to time, you may find yourself in the position where the studio executives mandate that you add in these training scenes in order to pander to those toxic fans we talked about earlier. Of course, it's not the executives' fault that you now have a bunch of extra work to do. It's those toxic fans' fault. If they just didn't care so much about this franchise that they grew up with and built friendships around and, saw as a source of comfort in difficult times, if they would just stop caring so much, then we would be free to change Star Wars to whatever we want it to be. But mandates are mandates, so if you are told you have to show your Jedi doing some training, here's a very brief summary of lightsaber combat forms. I know, it's going to be so boring, but trust me, understanding this little bit of history is really going to help you to subvert it much more accurately when writing your story. Now, there were 7 predominant lightsaber combat forms recognized by the Jedi Council at the time of the Clone Wars, and throughout the course of his or her or their or Zer's apprenticeship, a Jedi would be able to choose from one of these forms to focus their studies on and work towards gaining mastery in. Each of these forms represented a different combat philosophy, some geared more towards the offensive and some designed more for the defensive. And whichever form a Jedi chose to specialize in said a lot about how they viewed their role as a Jedi and how they saw the world around them. I know, super lame, right? Just do your best to stay awake. Starting off with Form 1, this is the most basic form of lightsaber combat, and it's where all Padawans begin. This is where you learn the fundamentals of how to move with the weapon, larger sweeping motions, wide, steady swings, proper stances, that sort of thing. And while this was usually seen as beginner stuff, and most Jedi moved on after gaining proficiency with this form, you do run across a few who took a special interest in it, Master Kit Fisto probably being the most prominent among them. It's too bad he never learned any other forms though, otherwise he might have lasted longer than 0.2 seconds against Old Man in a Dress. Form 2 is all about finesse, designed for one-on-one dueling, like a fencer. Count Dooku was a master of Form 2, being so committed to maximizing his efficiency in it that he had a custom-made lightsaber hilt that curves a little to the right, allowing him to manipulate the weapon much more ergonomically and with blazing speed. At least I think that's why it's curved like that. Or it could just be genetics. A curved hilt isn't all that uncommon, after all. Apparently about 20% of the population has at least a little curve in their hilt, and some people even claim to prefer it. I know Star Wars Theory has a curved hilt he likes to show off from time to time. Form 3 focuses more on defense. It was originally designed to protect against volleys of incoming blaster bolts, but as General Kenobi showed, it's also effective against heavily armed opponents, emphasis on armed. Now Form 4 is for the fancy-footed, involving a lot of jumping and acrobatics to overwhelm and confuse enemies. Form 5 featured more powerful overhead attacks and was favored by taller fighters who were able to use their physical presence to quickly gain the upper hand over weaker enemies. Ahsoka also used a variation of this form, substituting quick, nimble attacks for the heavy overhead ones, and with great success. Animated Ahsoka, of course. Old Lady Ahsoka, well, we'll get to that in a bit. Form 6 is sort of a master of none form, combining principles from all the previous 5 Jedi forms into one diverse, well-rounded, but ultimately less powerful and less unique combination of moves. This became the standard for most Jedi at the height of the Old Republic, where combat was less common, and a Swiss Army knife of attacks that can handle most situations was seen as more practical than one powerful style that had to compensate for its weaknesses in other areas. And lastly, we have Form 7, which at this point was all but banned by the Jedi Council, as it had the undesirable tendency to push one to the dark side by utilizing fear and anger, both yours and your opponent's, to fuel a wild and terrifying flurry of powerful blows. Mace Windu used his own homebrew variation of Form 7, which is part of what allowed him to overcome old Palpatine, but the standard form was most famously used by Darth Maul in his fights against Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. This powerful, chaotic, unpredictable form, combined with his use of the two-bladed lightsaber, is what allowed him to hold off both Jedi for as long as he did. Now, don't forget, no one actually wants to see any of this represented in live action. That would be insane. I mean, could you imagine if we made a whole show revolving around, a master teaching his Padawans the way of lightsaber combat? That would be like Cobra Kai in space, and nobody wants to see that. Again, I'm only explaining all of this to you so that you A, know how to subvert it, and B, use as little of it as possible, just enough to satisfy your mandate. A classic example of this comes from The Last Jedi, where some people complained about how what's her name? The junk trader girl. God, this is embarrassing. We have a whole movie coming out for her and everything, and I'm the head writer. Why can't I remember her name? Oh well, we'll just go with Junk Trader Girl for now. When The Last Jedi came out, some people complained about how Junk Trader Girl had quote-unquote no combat training before she fought a bunch of elite soldiers in a wildly outnumbered, impossible-to-win fight, even though we literally showed her training with Jedi Master Rock, the most famous rock Jedi who ever lived. That scene was amazing and not cringe, so I don't even know what they were complaining about. But in response to that criticism, the executives mandated that the very first thing we see her doing in the next movie is training, which we accomplished by showing her floating with some rocks and performing a bit of light calisthenics. Boom, training, easy. Fans were so happy to see that scene. Probably. Or not, I don't actually care. Anyway, now that you know a bit about the history of lightsaber combat, let's get into the writing side of things. Now, the first thing you want to do here is make sure that all physics are just completely thrown out the window. See, with a traditional sword, you're typically relying on the blade's weight to drive your movement, and then using the counterweight in the pommel to balance it out. And while your muscles are definitely involved with guiding the blade toward the right place, the laws of gravity and inertia have just as much to do with the power behind these maneuvers as the strength of the wielder does. And this was not the case with lightsabers. Remember all those nerds who worked on the original movies and wrote the old books? Well, they seem to think that since a lightsaber's blade is made of light, which has no mass, that would mean that the lightsaber itself has no mass, aside from the hilt, which would mean that the entire economy of motion would be dictated by your wrists and arms, maneuvering just the hilt to angle the blade. This is why you had to have your Padawans train with real lightsabers instead of, say, wooden swords, which, as I established before, have a drastically different weight distribution than lightsabers. If lightsabers are effectively weightless, but you have your Padawans training with heavy wooden swords, then all of the muscle memory and strength training they're building up with these exercises would be completely useless once they transition to using real lightsabers. Now, if you want an example of how this would feel, just grab your nearest sword-like weapon, a broom handle or something, and swing it around a few times. Then grab your nearest hilt-like object and wave it around. See the difference? See how strange it feels to try and strike without the weight of a blade at the end? You see how this could understandably take years of training to become competent with, to be able to angle the blade in just the right way to block an incoming attack, all without cutting your own head off? This is what made the weapon so unwieldy for those who were untrained in the art of lightsaber combat, but made it the perfect pairing for a Jedi Knight, whose years of martial training combined with their connection to the Force gave them an almost supernatural ability to divorce their physical movements from their logical brain, which sees a blade and expects to have to compensate for its weight. Instead, they allowed the Force to influence each and every movement, reaching an almost meditative state in which they were able to intercept and deflect blaster bolts with perfect accuracy and duel with unrivaled precision, agility, focus, and speed, almost faster than thought. This truly was an elegant weapon from a more civilized age. So yeah, you can just take all of that nonsense and just get rid of it. The lightsabers in your story should feel like they weigh at least 30 to 35 pounds, with the majority of that weight placed right at the tip, at the worst possible balance point, so that your characters have to heave them around like battle axes. Not the one-handed riding axes of the Rohirrim. I'm talking big two-handed dwarven axes. Now, you do have to be careful with this, because it could have the potential to look cool when used by larger, more muscular characters. So you want to make sure you mostly cast wafy young women in these roles instead. The less muscle tone, the better. Really have them show show in their faces how much effort it takes them to bring these weightless weapons around to bear. And throw in some guttural grunts and growls too, for good measure. Forget about the composed and confident cadence, the natural flow and rhythm of yesterday's duels. Instead, have your characters screech their frustrations out, like we writers do at our weekly Scream therapy sessions. This will make your fights feel more gritty and visceral, which segues us nicely into talking about lightsaber damage. Now, with lightsaber damage these days, you're really going to want to turn that all the way down, actually. I know we can see references from the old movies where lightsabers are incredibly powerful, effortlessly cutting through thick metal, even blast doors, and cutting down armored battle droids as if they were paper, slicing off limbs like it's their day job. But that's a little too graphic for modern audiences, so make sure that the lightsabers in your story just kind of bounce off of even the most basic types of armor. And have a slice across the face, just leave little tiny burn marks on the skin, easily recoverable, as long as you're a main character. Of course, if an extra even gets touched by a lightsaber, make sure they flail around and die on the floor immediately, especially if the damage was nowhere near a vital organ, okay? Oh, and speaking of vital organs, I know the toxic fans have made this next point into a meme or whatever, but lightsabers to the chest or stomach legitimately do not kill you anymore, we decided. Yes, we know, once upon a time that sort of injury seemed like kind of a big deal or whatever, but getting stabbed is a cheap dramatic beat that we can play off of without having to commit to any sort of consequence for it. And there's actually no limit on how many characters you can do this with, or even how many times per character. It's free real estate. On that note, let's pivot away from writing for a brief moment and talk about casting your characters. As I mentioned earlier, the days of casting strong, dexterous, athletic actors who have clearly put a great deal of effort into learning how to fight are over. That stuff's for nerds, and besides, nobody even notices anyway. The only thing they're looking at are the pretty colors, so just cast anybody. Seriously, anyone. Give them a stick and tell them to have at it. Don't worry about form or poise or strength discrepancies. If an actor forgets they're carrying a weapon that would allow them to win the fight, don't worry about it. We'll just Epstein it in post. Oh, and speaking of extras, if we don't care who you cast as your main characters, you can rest assured that we don't give two flying Minoc farts who's in the suits for the faceless bad guys. Hell, you can come grab the two homeless guys that live outside my apartment. They fight each other all the time. Not because I pay them to or anything, that's what they like to do. The last thing to remember when writing for lightsabers in Disney Star Wars is make sure you avoid setting up any sort of emotional payoffs or meaningful reasons for your fights to be happening in the first place. And this one is key. See, in the old, outdated, culturally irrelevant Star Wars, every single lightsaber fight was a dramatic climax for the characters involved, and for the story at large. And all of the intrigue and tension built up across the whole movie came to a head as the two opposing philosophical differences clashed in the physical world. The duel of the fates, light versus dark in an epic battle, the crossing of red blades with blue and green, something not seen in the galaxy for 100 years. The fight that began the Clone Wars and the fight that ended them. The fight between brothers, one consumed by the fear of loss and desire for power, and the other left with the unthinkable task of having to stop him permanently. Two unstoppable masters of swordsmanship facing off in a brilliant blaze of blue and white, resulting in the death of a noble Jedi and the birth of a ruthless villain. Confronting that villain for the third time in 10 years. Luke coming face to face with the man who killed his mentor, who had his aunt and uncle murdered in their home, who has the lives of his friends in the palm of his hand, and who he then discovers to be his own father. The final battle in the Emperor's throne room, where Luke momentarily gives in to the temptation of the dark side, before ultimately declaring the truth about his identity and his father's, a declaration that resurrects and redeems Anakin Skywalker in his final moments. These fights were about more than just good versus evil. They were about honor, redemption, hope, bravery, vengeance, love, pride, betrayal, fear, anger, hate, suffering. How lame is that? People feeling things in movies? People don't watch movies to feel things anymore. People watch movies to not feel things. Don't you get it? They don't want to watch actors give compelling performances. They want Marvel jokes and slapstick humor. They don't care what a character thinks about the world around them. They want substanceless cameos and key jangling. The real world is just too chaotic and toxic right now. Everyone is angry, and since we're all isolated from each other and stuck relying on unfulfilling parasocial relationships and anonymous interactions, all people want from the content they consume is just more mindless entertainment where they can shut off their brains for 2 hours and stare at some pretty colors. That's it. That's all you have to do. You don't have to work so hard, Tony. You don't have to put in all that effort. You spent, 2 years handcrafting the story for Andor? Making sure every word had impact and every scene had meaning? What a waste of time. Didn't anyone tell you that you can be completely void of substance these days and still be hyper successful? Just look at The Force Awakens, where we took Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber, the one used in one of the most precisely choreographed and expertly executed duels in cinema history, handed down as an heirloom and then tragically lost in one of the most dramatic and culturally impactful scenes in cinema history. We took that lightsaber and gave it to a freaking janitor and had him face off against against an actual Sith Lord. Guess what happens? He gets his freaking spine melted. Then we proceeded to give the lightsaber to Junk Trader Girl. And by give the lightsaber to Junk Trader Girl, I mean we literally wrote it so that she's suddenly able to use Force telekinesis to grab it. She's also suddenly able to hold her own against the Sith Lord, even though, just like the janitor, she's never held a lightsaber. You would think that someone with no combat experience, who lived her whole life as an orphan just trying to make it to the next meal, that her instinct would be that of self-preservation, that she would run away from even the possibility of a fight. But see, that's the genius of our subversive writing. Everything that we establish that should inform her motivations, we just throw out and make it so that she's an empty self-insert for the audience, completely void of any personality. This way, we can send blank slate Junk Trader Girl to the island that sad Luke is hiding on so that it feels to the audience like they're the ones going to get Luke. It doesn't matter that sending Junk Trader Girl makes no sense compared to sending someone like Leia, who I guess might want to see her brother or whatever, but trust me, this way is better. This way, blank slate Junk Trader Girl, and by extension the audience, gets to be the one to bring Luke back to the Force, back to the fight. I mean, not actually back to the fight, but you know what I mean. Oh, and just wait until the boss, Mr. Filoni, gives you one of his OCs to play with in your story. Talk about easy money. With Ahsoka, we took an aging actress with very little physicality, gave her about 10 minutes of sword training, and then set her up against Hayden freaking Christensen, whose lightsaber is to this day a seamless extension of his body, even after 20 years. He made her performance look absolutely embarrassing, and literally no one cared. All they saw was that Vader Vadered, and that was good enough. And just in case you need even more examples of how to do this correctly, let's talk about the Acolyte. Oh boy, my favorite one so far. This one takes all the elements we've just established about how we at Disney have characterized lightsaber combat and perfects it to a T. Have characters use lightsabers when they shouldn't and not use lightsabers when they absolutely should? Check. Clunky baseball bat looking combat? Check. Ignoring damage? Check. Ignoring power scaling? Double check. Contradicting lore? Oh, you betcha. Check, check, check. This show is the epitome of the writing style I'm trying to teach you. Write whatever the hell you want, however you want, spend no time or effort at all, just throw dots up on the screen and let the audience cope their way into connecting them for you. This is writing perfected for the modern era. This is peak fire bro. This is Disney Star Wars. So go on then, off with you. Go write the next great Star Wars lightsaber fight. Take everything I taught you today and let it blossom into exactly the kind of soulless sludge we're constantly oozing out onto our streaming platform. Sure, we have record low subscribers, terrible review ratios, and our stock is dropping faster than our producer's pants at that one pizza parlor. But it's like I said before, that's all just the haters, the toxic fans, the ones who care so much about Star Wars. You know, for all their toxic and hateful rhetoric, I bet that if we decided to give in and start making stories like we did back in the day, you know, if we started putting effort into being consistent with the rules of the universe our stories are set in, started setting up and paying off meaningful emotional beats, writing likable and nuanced characters with understandable and approachable worldviews who, you know, speak to each other like real humans do, not speaking in strange, stunted platitudes or catchphrases, who build deep relationships, even romances that are built up over time instead of overnight, where heroes are allowed to be sacrificial with no get-out-of-death-free cards. Real stories with real consequences. Yeah, I bet if we started writing like that again, then all those toxic fans would come crawling right back to us and start giving us their money again and telling their friends to watch our stuff, and then they would give us their money too. And we'll screw you and your money. That's never gonna happen. We're Disney, and we don't do that here.